Good afternoon, everyone, and we're so excited that you all chose to join us for our session, which is a consultative approach to providing integrated classroom support. My name is Madison Van Pelt. I'm a current school psychology graduate student in the Educational Specialist Program at Millersville University, and I'm completing my internship right now currently at the Wilson School District in Berks County.
Good afternoon, I'm Drew Hunter. I am assistant professor, I get those mixed up, at Millersville University. I had spent a couple of years here at Patton, and prior to that I was a school psychologist for about 10 years, so I am a professor in our school psychology program there. And we are excited to be here to present some of Madison's work.
So we have some goals for this session, and we're hoping that this session will demonstrate the interrelated nature of academic skills and student behavior, how the process of consultation can be used to work collaboratively with teachers to identify instructional match within classroom materials, and finally, the effects of integrated service delivery in which instructional modifications coupled with behavioral reinforcement produce positive behavior change within the general education classroom. So some key terms and ideas that we'll be discussing throughout this presentation are multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, the problem-solving process and the processes that can lie within that, including instructional consultation and functional behavioral analysis, learning theory and instructional match, and the interrelated nature of academics and behavior.
So we're not going to spend a lot of time on foundational ideas related to multi-tiered systems of support. We're hoping to get a little into the idea of integrating these systems. But just a few key points before we kind of jump into some more ideas maybe in that vein, or just kind of highlighting some of the components of an MTSS, right? So we all know that multi-tiered system of supports is a preventative model, right? Designed to support all students as they work to achieve meaningful educational outcomes. And when we say educational outcomes, right, that can be academic and behavioral outcomes, right? Because as schools now, we're expected to do a lot more than just teach reading, writing, and math, right? We're to have people ready for 21st century job skills, which includes a lot of interpersonal domains, problem-solving skills, etc. So MTSS is the framework to support all students on that journey. Some key components there obviously are this idea of evidence-based instruction or evidence-based practices for all students and universal screening. Okay, now as we move up the tiers, right, our evidence-based practices and assessment practices become more intense and more frequent. So while at tier 1 we may provide evidence-based curricula to all students, screen them, trying to find students who are or not meeting our objectives, at our advanced tiers we might be doing diagnostic assessment and weekly, daily progress monitoring with students while providing interventions maybe to small groups of students or individual students. Okay? Go ahead. So many of you, who's here in a school that's implementing both academic and behavioral MTSS, PBIS or RTI, right? Okay, lots of meetings I assume, right? Okay, so that's the point of like what we're trying to get at today is how do we integrate these systems and not just integrate meetings, right? Because a lot of the work around integrating tiered systems of support has to deal with maybe integrating meeting structures and not overlapping duties and things like that, right? But to do like really truly integrate all your integration efforts, right, is challenging, okay? Do you have a student who has an academic intervention and like a separate behavior intervention in your school, right? Yes, everyone's nodding their heads, okay? So great, then you're in the right place then. What really unifies both of these systems is this idea of the problem-solving process, okay? The problem-solving process is the foundation that multi-tiered systems of support have been built upon. This has been around for a while. I want to go back to maybe like 60s, 70s. Came out of like behavioral psychology. Then my school fight folks, everyone's heard of Standino, right? He took this and adapted it and invented curriculum-based measurement. And here we are, steamrolling into academic kind of RTI systems, right? And then on the other side of things, we have PBIS systems, which have been around for a while as well. Very evidence-based, lots of empirical support for that, lots of support for implementing those systems in your schools. But what makes them similar is they are both built on this process, right? This idea of applying the scientific method to everyday problems that we encounter in schools, okay? So our problem-solving process deals with 4 stages of evaluation: problem identification, problem analysis, and implementation, right? So our problem identification is simply the act of finding the students who aren't meeting the objectives that we want them to in our school, right? And defining what is their current level of performance and where do we need them to be so that they can be successful later in life. In our problem analysis stage, this is where we're trying to figure out why they're not meeting our expectations. What is the cause of this student's struggle that's preventing them from acquiring reading skills or behaving to our expectations in our classroom, okay? During the implementation phase, that's where we implement our instructional and intervention supports for that student, okay? This implementation also includes fidelity, right? Which we don't like to talk about, but fidelity is an important part of the implementation stage. And then finally, we get to the evaluation stage. So this is where we are collecting progress monitoring data and making decisions about, did our intervention work or did it not work? If it's successful, do we need to continue or fade supports? If it didn't work, then we need to kind of come back to the problem analysis phase and figure out what maybe do we need to do differently to get this student matched to supports that are going to help them grow, right? So all of you implementing MTSS, this sounds like the general process that you go through with all of your students, right? Whether it's PBIS or academics, correct? Right? So bringing this process together is a good way to kind of merge those, because whether I'm part of a Tier 1 team who's looking at office discipline referrals to identify needs at Tier 1, implement an intervention to that, monitor it, right? Or whether I'm doing academic screening data and looking at broad curricular areas that maybe need to improve to meet students' needs, right? Collecting that data and analyzing it. We're following the same process, and one team of individuals can do that. All right. Another thing that we, or at least I don't know if Madison feels this way, but this is what I teach, so she can have her own opinions on it, that I think binds these two systems together is learning theory, okay? Again, I'm going to assume that everyone is probably really familiar with our 3-term operant contingency, right? We've all heard the ABCs of behavior, right? Okay? Now, this also applies to academics, okay? I think when we think of this, we probably think of what? Like behavior function, right? Or problem behavior, okay? But this process actually illustrates what's going on when your students are learning basic academic skills as well, okay? Now, the contingency is a little misleading because it makes you think that the antecedent always exists. Now, it may be always been there, but it's through behavior coming in contact with reinforcement and or punishment that we learn to discriminate which signals in our environment want us to respond one way versus responding another way, okay? So, over time, behavior that gets reinforced, we notice what signals come before that, and then we know that when we see that in the environment, if we perform this behavior, we usually get some sort of reinforcement, okay? We call that stimulus training or discrimination training. You're having fun down there, right? But we're having fun in here too. All right, behavior function, let's do it. Okay, so a discriminative stimulus is an antecedent that reliably, it signals the availability of reinforcement contingent upon the performance of a specific behavior. So, S delta is a group of stimulus or stimuli that should not produce that same response, and if it does, it shouldn't get reinforced, okay? So, this illustrates the idea of how this works with both behavior and academics, okay? And instead of teacher A and teacher B, we could put in my wife and myself, and this holds true, okay? My wife walks in the door and everyone goes, the dogs, the children, it's like, bah! I come in and nobody moves, okay? She is an SD for attention. I am an S delta for attention, okay? So they know that when she is there and they do things, she's going to pay attention to them. I'm going to go about my business, put my things away, take my shoes off, and then I will get to you, okay? So we get different responses. Same with academics, right? When we present a student with the word went and they read went and we give them correction, yes, that's right, praise, right? Then that's an SD then, provided that they only respond to went in the presence of went, okay? If we give went, they read come, we should give them some sort of corrective feedback, right? Not presenting them with reinforcement. Positive punishment, technically, it's not, bad punishment, right? But it is corrective feedback that is supposed to make it less likely that that behavior occurs again in the future. So that's technically punishment, right? So that is an S delta. Went is an S delta for come. So our job as teachers is to basically develop discrimination training in our students so that when they are presented with the appropriate academic, social, or environmental cues, they are giving the responses that we want, and we call that learning. All right? I'm going to hand it over to Madison now.
So as we just heard, there's many environmental variables that can act as antecedents, signaling the availability of reinforcement and thus influencing our students' behaviors within the general education classroom. So when we're moving through our problem-solving process, and we're in that problem analysis phase, we want to be considering the following variables. So we're collecting data on the student, the skills that they have, the skills that we would like to increase. But we also want to be cognizant that we're collecting data on the environmental variables that are also contributing to the behaviors or academic skill deficits that we're seeing within the classroom. One way that we can do this, and which is a large part of the instructional consultation model, which is an indirect service delivery where school psychologists can work with teachers to help identify behavioral or academic concerns with their students in the classroom, and then the teacher can go back and implement interventions to help that student be more successful, is looking at instructional match. And instructional match is taking into account all of the variables that could act as antecedents for both behavior and what we typically define as behavior, so off-task behaviors, calling out, but also those academic skills. When I see 1 + 1, I know to respond to, and that's a correct response. So when we're thinking about how we can alter these variables, we know that we have what the student can do and what the student may not be able to do quite yet. We're looking at instruction, so high quality teaching. Are there opportunities to respond? How is the modeling and corrective feedback occurring in the classroom, as well as the learning task? So when we're in that problem analysis stage, we want to be looking, is the learning task at instructional match, meaning that we're providing the appropriate challenge for the student to continue in their learning, but not too difficult that the student is unable to complete the task. And so Giggling recommends that when we're looking at these instructional tasks, we're looking to see for reading comprehension tasks that the student knows approximately 93 to 97% of the words within the text. When we see that students are outside of that instructional ratio, so if they're at 90 or even 91%, the student is spending a lot of cognitive energy trying to either decode the words or recall sight words, that they're not truly focusing on what the text is saying, and so we'll see a decrease in those reading comprehension skills. Additionally, when we're looking at more drill and practice activities, such as math facts, or if we're doing flashcards, we're looking to make sure that that instructional match is happening if the student knows about 70 to 85% of the words. So if we're going through a flashcard activity, if we have 10 words, we want to know that that student knows about 10 of them. Another variable that we can consider when creating instructional match in our classroom is working memory. So if we do have a student who's reading on grade level text and they're about that 90 to 91% known words, and they're a 7th grade student, and we know that we can alter our instruction by modeling, scaffolding, providing some teaching on some of those words to help them bump up into that instructional level, that's one way that we can modify our instruction to help create instructional match. However, keeping working memory in mind, if we have a 7-year-old student who would need to learn 10 words to be able to move into that instructional ratio, maybe it's not the best choice for us to modify our instruction, but yet we should modify that learning task, whether that be moving them into a different reading comprehension book that they might have more background knowledge on or know more of those sight words in that book, or moving them into a leveled text that's closer to the 93-97% known. So as we can see through Gickling's work, and when we're in that instructional level, we can see that students are able to comprehend better, they're able to complete more tasks, which makes sense because if the task is something that they can adequately do, they're going to persevere. However, when these tasks move into our frustrational level, task completion is harder for that student to do. So extending this theory, Gickling and Armstrong in their 1978 study, we're looking to see if modifying instructional level also affected the students' behavior within the classroom. So in their sample, they had 8 students from a rural Title I school district. The sample consisted of 4 first grade students and 4 second grade students. And the students were identified because they were currently at frustrational level in their instructional materials. And so we'll talk a little bit about how they defined those levels in a little bit. So what they did prior to starting this research was they collected academic data on the students. What were the skills that they had and what did they know? What was the task that was being provided to them? How difficult was it and how long it was? Then they also collected behavioral data, so both academic behavioral data, such as task completion, were they able to complete the task and to what percentage? Task comprehension, how were they understanding the task, as well as their on-task behavior. So tasks were then modified to meet the 3 instructional levels. Frustrational level being for those drill and practice, they were less than 70% for their seat work activity, or less than 90% known for a reading activity. Instructional level included work for each individual student that was 70 to 80% known for seat work, or 93 to 97% known for a reading activity. And finally, they also did work in the independent level, so this would be work that was fairly easy for the student, in which the student knew 90% known for seat work, or 90% known for seat work, or more than 97% known for a reading activity. So these sessions were conducted 3 times a week for 7 weeks. They collected baseline for 6 sessions, and then after that, each student received 5 sessions in each instructional level, starting with frustrational, so the work that would be hard for them, moving into that instructional match level where we're giving them the appropriate challenge, and ending with independent, work that we would consider to be easy for the student. And what they found, looking at the first grade data, is you can see when we moved into the frustrational level, while interestingly, task comprehension jumped a little bit, our on-task behaviors stayed pretty consistent from what we had at baseline. Additionally, task completion dropped significantly from that baseline condition. When they modified the instructional work for the students to be at that instructional level, the area where they have that appropriate room for growth, we can see that all 3 measures increased significantly from baseline. And then again, in the independent level, while task completion and task comprehension stayed high because the student was able to complete most of that work by themselves, on-task behaviors again decreased, moving back to a level that was comparable with baseline. For our second graders, we saw similar trends. So we have our baseline data. We can see that task comprehension this time went down when they were in that frustrational level. However, task comprehension. However, task completion and on-task behavior stayed relatively consistent from baseline. Again, as we saw with our first graders, the instructional level brought all 3 indicators up significantly from baseline. And then at the independent level, while our task completion stayed around that 100% mark, our on-task behaviors returned back to baseline. And so what they were able to see through this is that instructional level not only affects academic skill behaviors, so their ability to comprehend what they're doing as well as their ability to complete these tasks within instructional sessions, but it also impacted other behaviors in the classroom, such as their on-task and off-task behaviors.
Addison, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Back slide. I just want to be very clear here that we're not talking about leveled texts. I know, just so that, okay. This is about the students match with a specific activity. This is not about leveled text. So when we're talking about instructional level, we're saying that if we're giving them skill and drill practice, that instructional match means that student knows somewhere between 70 and 85% of them. For the reading, they can read the words in that text with 93 to 97% accuracy. It's that text. It is not like a broad level text that you're going to pull off your shelf. We are not supporting that practice. Just want to make that clear as well, right?
Yes.
Also, too, fluency is a part of this. Now, fluency is more of like a general outcome measure, progress monitoring tool, right? When you start looking at text in terms of, and skills in terms of the accuracy, what the student knows there, you're getting more into a sub-skill mastery type of thing, which is beyond the scope of this program as well. But I also just want to be clear that we are not suggesting that oral reading fluency is not a useful, reliable, and valid measure that should be part of your MTSS system. And in fact, we do use some of those data later in the presentation.
So another study that demonstrates the interrelated nature of academic skills and behavior and shows that academics can act as antecedents for problem behavior was a study done by Umbry et al. In 2004. It was a single case study design in which they were looking at a 4th grade student. And this 4th grade student was chosen as he displayed a lot of off-task behaviors when he was working on his independent work, such as looking around the room, kicking his chair, and making noises. And this occurred in both reading and math. And so a student interview showed that this student was saying that this work was easy for him and he could complete it fairly quickly, and that when he was done his work, he liked to go help others in the room. So an FBA was completed in which they hypothesized that when the student completed his independent work, he engaged in these off-task behaviors to gain access to an activity. So during phase 1, they just wanted to kind of test this hypothesis. And so for 4 days in math, on days 1 and 3, he was given what he would typically receive in the general education curriculum. And then on days 2 and 4, they increased the level of challenge on the work, making that work now fall into that instructional match level to see how this affected his behavior within the classroom. So they collected data on his on-task behaviors. So during phase 2, this intervention was extended into an AB-AB design. So the student would receive 1 week of typical instruction materials and then 1 week of instructional materials at his instructional match level in both reading and math. And then they continued to collect data on the student's on-task behavior. So as we can see, when he was having the typical task, both in the first phase of the typical task and the second phase of the typical task, we're seeing, fairly moderate on-task behaviors. It was relatively around 50 to 60%. The first time it increased a little bit the second time that they returned to typical tasks. But when they put the student and gave him instruction at his instructional match level and made the task a little bit more challenging for him, we saw that he was able to stay on task for longer periods of time during that instruction. So this is just another example to show how academics and the instruction that we're giving to students, how it's meeting their instructional needs within our general education curriculum, can impact some of the behaviors that we might be seeing in the classroom that can be disruptive to both themselves and their learning, as well as others. So using some of these principles from learning theory, the problem-solving process, instructional consultation, and some of those studies that we just looked at, I completed a case example with a teacher in a school district. I did instructional consultation. So again, that was an indirect service delivery model where I worked one-on-one with the teacher to move through those problem-solving steps. So we were working with a first grade male student. So when we started the process, she came with a couple of academic and behavioral areas of concern, starting with distractibility, as well as she had stated that the student was below grade level in both math and then his ELA in both phonics and sight words. So some of the methods that I used through this problem-solving process were a functional behavioral analysis to learn more about the behaviors of concern, reading and math instructional assessments to both identify and evaluate the instructional match that was occurring in the classroom, as well as the classroom data that the teacher had been collecting on how he was doing relative to other peers in the classroom. So this was kind of the questions I was looking to ask through or answer through this process is, what is the source of the consultees problem? So when we're moving through an instructional consultation model, we're working with teachers to see, do they need more knowledge on an intervention? Do they need help implementing an intervention? Are they just not sure where to go? So that was one of our key research questions. Additionally, what is the student's academic and behavioral concerns in the classroom? Really narrowing down on the behaviors and academic skills that she was seeing, being more specific. What was the function of the student's behavior? What is the student's current level in reading and math? And then finally, what interventions, supports, and/or resources could be implemented in the classroom to address the student's academic and behavioral concerns to help increase academic success? So when we started the problem identification process, she had come, and her number one concern was his behavior in the classroom. So she had said that he was distractible, a lot of distractibility. So we worked together to collect some data, do some observations to really narrow down what some of these behaviors looked like. So this included calling out during instruction. He had a hard time staying in his instructional area, whether that be at his desk or on the carpet, playing with objects that were not part of the lesson, making noises throughout, quiet seat time as well as whole group instruction, and tapping the pencils. And her main concern was that these behaviors were not only impacting his learning in the classroom, but as well as some of his other peers. Additionally, she had identified concerns in math. So at the time, the student was currently able to identify 1 through 5. This was the beginning of first grade, but she had said, coming out of kindergarten after summer, they're looking for students to at least be able to identify 1 through 10 and be able to manipulate 1 through 10 numbers through addition and subtraction. And additionally, he could rote count to 66. So at the end of kindergarten, typically she had stated that they can rote count to 100. And then by the end of first grade, they were looking for them to rote count to 120. So he was a little behind in those skills. Additionally, she had phonics concerns, so they used a 95% group phonics screener, which they had correlated to certain grade level skills. So he was not quite mastering some of the first grade level skills and was not quite mastering all of the kindergarten ones either. So at the time, he was identifying 69% of lowercase letters. He knew 52% of his letter sounds and 80% of short vowel sounds. And then finally, she also had a concern over his sight word recognition. He knew 5 sight words and was currently working at that time to master the pre-primer sight list. So then he would have to master that, the primer sight list, before he could move on to the grade level sight list. And so one of the places we started with this problem analysis, due to some of the academic skill concerns, was doing that instructional assessment. So I really wanted to see, and I wanted to work with her to see what instructional level, using those guidelines that we had through that research study, was he at frustrational level within curriculum materials, outside of that 93 to 97% known for reading comprehension, or 70 to 85% known for drill and practice? And if so, what level, how could we modify either instructions or the learning task to help him meet that instructional match? So I completed a math instructional assessment and a reading instructional assessment with the student and the teacher. And we were just looking at grade level skills for math. So we used the math scope and sequence that they had at this district, kind of working through, could he identify numbers? How high could he rote count? We incorporated some subitizing, so blocks with dots in a row. Could he identify how many dots were on the card? If not, was he able to do one-to-one correspondence? We moved into a little bit of addition using them. If this block has 3 and this block has 5, how many does that equal? But we noticed when we started getting into numbers, identifying them, and then being able to use them for addition and subtraction, his math skills kind of decreased. So we identified through this instructional assessment that he was not at instructional match within the math curriculum and the things that he was getting provided, as well as we identified some areas of concern were increasing his numbers and numeration skills, as well as working on patterns and relationships. Additionally, I completed a reading instructional assessment, and so this is where the teacher provides a reading text that she would typically use with a whole class instruction. Additionally, she provided me with a reading text that she would use with him during small group. And what we started doing was just reading that text out loud to him. We read a portion, and then we asked him some comprehension questions, starting with unaided questions. What do you think happened, or what's going to happen next? Moving into some aided questions, more of those who, what, when, where, why, and then moving into forced choice if we need it. We found that his listening comprehension was pretty accurate, so we moved into that word search, and this is where you can find that instructional match level within those curriculum materials. So we did a word search with him where we popped out words and we would point, can you read this word, to see how many he could identify, and took a tally of how many he knew and how many he didn't know. And we did a quick calculation to find out that he was way outside of the 93 to 97% known level. So we knew that this text specifically was not at instructional match for him. It was at frustrational level. And using some of the theories of working memory, we knew that we couldn't modify our instruction to help him meet that instructional match. So we moved into his small group text. We completed the same process and also found that he was at frustrational level in that specific text. So we ended up creating a teacher-made story with him using some of the sight words that he had. We asked him to read it. And one thing that we noticed throughout all of these processes is when he came to a word that he didn't know, there was no attempt to decode or think about what the word may be. He kind of just looked and signaled for help. And so overall, what we found is that the curriculum materials that we were using in both whole group and small group were at frustrational level for him. And we hypothesized that this might be contributing to some of the behavior we were seeing during ELA and math, a lot of the calling out, getting up, moving around, and being off task. Additionally, we identified some places that we could start increasing skills, so that word study, decoding, and encoding, as well as word recognition and meaning. And then finally, we also looked at classroom data, so the teacher was collecting a lot on him, reading probes, phonics probes to kind of monitor what that looks like in the classroom. We had our behavioral data started, which I'll go into next, as well as then we had a math writing sample because we were curious, can he write numbers? And then math rote counting, we continued to practice that skill just to see if it was increasing while we were collecting data. So for the behavior too, so we had all this academic skill concerns, and we also had some behavior concerns. So one of the first things we did for our behavior was really giving it an operational definition. We wanted to make sure that if we said he's engaging in distractible behaviors, that we both knew what that looked like to adequately collect data on that. So we defined that as engaging in behaviors such as calling out or making noises without teacher permission, leaving seat or predetermined instructional area, and playing with materials and objects in ways not defined for the teacher for the lesson or without teacher permission. And so the teacher filled out a FAIR T, which is basically an interview form talking about what happens before the behavior, what is the behavior, and what happens after the behavior. So we could narrow down some of those antecedents and consequences that might be influencing the student's behavior within the classroom. And what we found, as Drew had mentioned, is for the academics, we noticed that those underlying skill deficits in both math and phonics and sight words were resulting in him responding to instruction, whether that be writing on an activity or answering a question out loud incorrectly, resulting in him getting the maintaining consequence of positive punishment through reprimands or corrections. So when he was answering a word wrong or incorrectly filling out a math worksheet, the teacher was responding to him by saying, no, that's not how we do that, or no, it's this way. And so these tasks began to become aversive to him, knowing that they were resulting in positive punishment. And then looking at our behavioral data, we also saw kind of interweaving with this, as these tasks are becoming aversive when given a non-preferred or new difficult task, we were seeing these distractibility behaviors which were maintained by negative reinforcement of escaping the task. When he's engaging in these behaviors, running around the room, leaving his instructional area, calling out, he's not working on these academic tasks that may be hard for him. And so as we were moving into figuring out what interventions or strategies or resources we wanted to implement, we prioritized our concerns. So we decided that the behavior of concern, distractibility, was our number one concern. We did want to target this and put in some sort of resource or support to help decrease these distractible behaviors and increase appropriate behaviors in the classroom. However, looking at all our data and knowing how some of these academic skill deficits were underlying these behaviors in the classroom, we also wanted to prioritize his phonics, helping him increase these decoding skills, letter recognitions, letter sounds, hopefully so that we can increase those skills, and he then would be earning or receiving consequence where, yes, that's a correct response, and these tasks would become less aversive for him. So our working hypothesis was when given a new, difficult, or non-preferred task, student will engage in distracted behaviors such as calling out, making noises, leaving his seat, and using materials in ways not defined as the teacher, which was resulting in the teacher either redirecting, reprimanding, or providing teacher or peer assistance to complete the activity in order to obtain negative reinforcement of not having to do the task. And then this was most likely to occur when the student had experienced a change in routine or conflict in a home. So some setting events that were kind of carrying over, and we were seeing an increase in these behaviors. So all in all, to sum this down, what we saw was there were academic skill deficits, and an instructional match was occurring within the classroom materials. And because of this, we were seeing a child exhibit behaviors to escape these tasks that were hard for him. So we decided that we were going to collect behavioral data, and we collected our baseline on this as well as our behavioral data through our intervention stage on the DBR. So this was collected 2 times a day by the teacher during ELA phonics whole group and then small group reading centers. We broke them up to give shorter observation lengths as well as to, because there was different things being asked of the student during those times. Additionally, because phonics was one of our other prioritized concerns, the reading specialist had been working with the student in an intervention group to increase some of those phonics skills. So she was providing weekly data to the teacher, who was then sharing it with me during our weekly consultation sessions. And so we chose to use the DBR because it's a simple, quick, and flexible way to measure a student's behavior. So the standard DBR has 3 standard behaviors: academically engaged, respectful, and disruptive. And then on the DBR, it gives operational definitions of these behaviors. So then once you're working either by yourself or with your team to review what these definitions are, and you predetermine the observation length at what times and who's going to complete these data, raters use a Likert scale to document the percentage of time that the student is engaging in the target behaviors. So for example, it could be, the student was 70% engaged during ELA, the student was 30% disruptive, and 80% respectful. And so the DBR was found, or there was evidence found that the DBR, the teachers rated as both an acceptable and a highly adaptive measure. So while the DBR has a form that has the 3 standard behaviors, there are also other versions of the DBR where you can fill in the behaviors that are most salient to what you're seeing. So all you would have to do is work as we did through this problem-solving process to identify the behaviors of concern and narrow them down. And you can utilize this tool on behaviors outside of what's on the standard form. Additionally, Brune et al. Found the DBR to demonstrate moderate to high inter-rater reliability. And when comparing the DBR to systematic direct observation, so if I would go in there and use, every time the student does this, take a tally, or if I have a certain interval length every 15 seconds, if the student engages in a behavior, I tally that. Between SEO, systematic direct observation, they found consistency between the data sources in terms of intervention effectiveness when considering both empirical and visual analysis. And so for what we decided to do to intervene on what we were seeing in the classroom is while we knew that these academic skill deficits were impacting the behavior in the classroom, the student was already working with the title specialist, the reading specialist, to target these behaviors. So what we chose to do was modify our environment, our antecedent variables, to bring the instruction that the student was currently receiving more into their instructional match level. So we picked interventions and strategies that are evidence-based, that have shown to prove effective results to help that student be at a place in the instructional materials where they were appropriately challenged while they were learning those academic skills. So during her small group, the teacher worked to incorporate a strategy called folding in. So that would be more on that drill in practice. If we have 10 words that we're working on, we want to make sure that the student knows 7 of those words, and 3 can be unknown, providing that appropriate challenge. Additionally, as part of a small group, they were rotating through centers when they weren't with the teacher, and we found that the computer level program that they were using in one of their activities was far into the frustrational level for our students. So we worked to modify this so that it was more meeting the students, creating instructional match. And finally, since we were seeing some of these behaviors and the student was aware that some of these tasks were hard for him due to some of his academic skill deficits, we also incorporated high probability request sequences. So when he was coming to small group, he was immediately engaging in calling out, leaving the table. So she worked to incorporate things that she knew the student was able to do and that the student knew that they were able to do, and that was preferred to kind of get that behavioral momentum so the student was participating and engaging, and she could continue that participation. For whole group, she also used those high probability request sequences. She used errorless learning. So if she put a word up on the board, what's this word? Cat, she would say it immediately, and then the students would repeat. And finally, while this last one doesn't tie into instructional match, she was also doing pre-correction feedback for the behavioral reinforcement system, which I'll describe a little bit later, but she was setting him up to be successful in all of his activities. So this is what I'm expecting of you. Here's our goal. These are the behaviors that we're working towards, and if we do this, then we'll receive this, helping him to be more successful and review those clear expectations. And I should say what was cool about the whole group strategies is this extended outside of just the students. So these became practices that she started incorporating in her whole group for everybody, which is really cool to see because this was benefiting not only the student that we were working with, but was generalizing to the other students in the classroom. So for our behavioral reinforcement system, prior to working with me, she already had a token economy sort of behavioral reinforcement set up in the classroom. But as we were working together, we noticed that some of the behaviors were sort of vague. So the student was moving through instructional lessons and they weren't sure, did I earn this? Did I not earn this? What do I have to do to earn this? So we worked to narrow in on some of the behaviors we were expecting and then using that pre-correction feedback to really be clear and consistent with the student. Additionally, we tied these behaviors back to the DBR and we incorporated the student in the data collection process. So the DBR that we used had smiley faces on it. And so she would highlight, 60%, 60%, and 70% for the student, and he would come with her to their small group table at the end of the instructional assessment, and they would talk about the behaviors that they saw. And they would talk about if he met his goals for that day, and if so, how many of the bears that he would receive. So he would receive 1 bear if he was 60% or more academically engaged, 1 bear if he was 60% or more respectful, and then 1 bear if he was 70% or less disruptive. And then if he earned all 3 bears at the end of the instructional session, he was able to choose a toy out of 5 pre-selected choices, and he was able to engage in a 5-minute break because we wanted to meet that function of the behavior. He was using these behaviors to escape tasks, so we wanted to meet his function and give him a break from academic activities. And this was also something that we had modified from the previous plan, as we had noticed there was some trouble transitioning out of reinforcement activities. So this was an area that we strengthened, really setting him up for success. You know, you get to use one of these 5 toys for 5 minutes, and they would start a timer so that there was less of a hectic transition when he had to move back into academic activities. And then, on top of all of this, there were times when the student wouldn't meet all of the 3 goals, so he would have leftover bears. So for example, if he was in phonics small group and he only earned 2 bears, he didn't have quite enough bears to earn a break, but what he could do was save those bears for the end of the day. And if he had 3 bears at the end of the day, he was able to engage in playing Legos while he waited for his bus. And this was just a way to still reward him for the behaviors that he was doing, but still keep our behavioral plan consistent. So as you can see, this is our DBR data. This is for academically engaged. So our baseline mean, he was academically engaged around 38%. And then after we started implementing both the antecedent strategies to increase instructional match, as well as the behavioral reinforcement strategies to reinforce appropriate behaviors, we saw that the intervention mean increased to 71% at that time, and that was actually exceeding his goal for being disruptive, or I guess almost exceeding the goal for being disruptive, 70% or less. And then additionally, when doing a PND calculation, a percentage of non-overlapping data, we had 75% of our data was non-overlapping. And when you look at the statistics for this, this would show that this was an effective intervention to target these academically engaged behaviors. So while we included the respectful behaviors, we did want to note that we didn't see much of a change in them. We did see that this was ineffective, but this was to be expected as we didn't directly intervene on respectful behaviors. We were looking more to increase academically engaged behaviors with modifying instructional tasks, as well as decrease disruptive behaviors through the behavioral reinforcement, but we weren't really directly intervening on this measure. We also, for our disruptive data, at the baseline mean, he was about 63% disruptive, and then through our intervention, we did see that that decreased to about 46%. When doing that same percentage of non-overlapping data, the PND calculations, we got a calculation of 50% of our data was non-overlapping, which could lead us to think that this was a questionable intervention at that time. Additionally, looking at some of the phonics data, because we were really curious to see, as he's gaining these academic skills, and as we've created curriculum materials that he can be successful in the classroom, will we see an increase in the academic skills, as well as his behavior, the appropriate behaviors in the classroom. So through this, we did see through her data that there was an increase. Percentage of non-overlapping data was 75%, which does signal an effective intervention, but it's hard to say, was it directly just the intervention that the title specialist was doing that was increasing these skills? Was it also confounded with some of the things that we were doing in the classroom to help him be more successful, and that he was engaging more with the curriculum content, so he was having access to more of the learning? It's hard to tease out, but it was cool to see that we were seeing behavioral progress and academic progress through all of these interventions. And now, while we shared all of that, there were some limitations to our study. The first being that this was an A-B design, so there was no reversal or anything to really truly show the effects of this. There was also some fidelity issues. While the teacher was honest about being fairly consistent with the behavioral reinforcement system, she was also honest that putting some of these instructional match techniques into her lessons was difficult. It was tricky. She had a lot of students. She was managing a bunch of small groups. So she was working to try to increase fidelity on the antecedent strategies. Additionally, we had an intervention package. So as you can see, we were implementing a lot of different things. We had multiple antecedent strategies. We had a consequence strategy. The title specialist was also doing an academic intervention. So it's really hard to say what truly caused behavioral or academic change. So that's something to keep in mind. We had unstable baselines, which can affect our data calculations. There was a lack of time, so this was part of course requirements for me for a project, and this came close to Christmas break and Thanksgiving break, so there was some time that we missed here, and I would have been interested to see, and going along with this too, if we would have had more time and we could have been implementing these strategies more and collecting more data, maybe changing some things, increasing fidelity, seeing how this would have impacted the student both behaviorally and academically. References.
Well, thank you for attending. We did want to open it up and leave time for questions. So if you have any questions, we're happy to field those. We can also hang around a couple minutes afterwards and chat with you as well. But thank you all for attending. Yeah.